Welcome to the second session of today. My name is Aziz Hallaj, and I'll be assisting in moderating the session. We are going to, in this next hour and a half, take the discussion that we have been talking about globally into a very specific area and talk a little bit about closer to home here in Beirut. And for discussants, we'll bring some of the main themes that we've been listening to in terms of challenging a dominant narrative on gentrification simply as a class issue, to bring in some of the intricacies that were brought in a post-colonial discourse onto other ways of looking at gentrification, and this time looking at a very site-specific case. Today we have four distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them all at once so that we don't have interruptions in between the speakers, and then we will move into the panel later on and open discussions. Our first speaker will be Mr. Hisham Ashkar. He's an architect and an urban planner, a cartographer, a photographer, and an investigative researcher. He's currently a PhD candidate in urbanism at HafenCity Universität-Hamburg, and he's working in his dissertation on changing the nature of public space in association with gentrification. The second speaker is Dr. Muna Khechen. Muna is a part-time senior lecturer at the American University in Beirut and a co-organizer of City Debates this year. She is also the director of the research component of the Gentrification and Urban Change in Ras Beirut, an AUB initiative, a neighborhood initiative that's being done in conjunction with the London School of Economics and the Ford Foundation. Muna is originally and most importantly an urban heritage consultant, and that's where we met many years ago. She works on several socioeconomic development efforts and policy support to municipalities and local government. She has worked on issues related to the challenges of post-war construction and rapid urbanization. Worked in several countries, including Lebanon, the USA, Afghanistan, Syria, Jordan, and with a multitude of international players like the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, the World Bank, ESQA, UNDP, and others. At the moment, she is going to talk to us more specifically about Ras Beirut gentrification process. The third speaker is Ms. Marieke Krijnen. Am I pronouncing it correctly? All right. She is a PhD student at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies in Ghent University, Belgium. And she is working right now on her PhD. She did a master's thesis entitled Facilitating Real Estate Development in Beirut, a Peculiar Case of Neoliberal Public Policy. She has worked with McGill, the Academic Urban Observatory at Alba, and she has done some surveys of listed heritage buildings in a project related to Mar Mikhael. While working in Belgium right now on her PhD, she is focusing on the role of the Lebanese diaspora and their role in influencing state decisions and state policies on the real estate market in Lebanon. She's going to hopefully challenge some of the neoliberal definitions of gentrifications by bringing the case straight into Beirut and looking at empirical data and information from Beirut. Our final speaker today is going to be Mr. Bruno Marot. And Bruno is a PhD candidate in urban planning, policy, and design at McGill in Canada. He has a BA from the Sorbonne University and 2 master's degrees in city planning and regional development. He's also at the moment a graduate research fellow at the Institut Français du Proche-Orient in Beirut, Lebanon. His doctoral research is focusing very carefully on the political economy of urban transformation in the Eastern Mediterranean cities and looking specifically at the case of Beirut. He's also done quite a bit of research on issues related to housing provision, land management, and contested urban environments. I'm going to ask the speakers to step up and give us their 15-minute presentations. Yes, because we only have an hour and a half and we're already late.
Okay.
We're going to try to stick with the 15-minute presentations. We're only 4 people and we need to have some discussion. So I'll say 15, I'll be a bit lenient. Okay. But I won't say 20 and be a bit lenient.
Well, I'll start by stating a nearly basic thing. Gentrification is an urban transformation within the context of law. It fosters and flourishes within legality, in line with laws and regulation. And if you go back to the founding document of gentrification, Ruth Glass text, nowadays it seems that few questions the reason why this depicted transformation took that form. Well, which form I mean? I mean the renovation of old Victorian houses, the shift from rent towards ownership, and so on and so on. But at the time of Ruth Glass, this was a bit clear to her contemporaries. And one of the first articles on gentrification, Hamnet in 1973, clearly pointed to one of its main driving forces, the British Rent Act of 1957. Well, this act basically decontrolled rent for the most valuable houses, paving the way for gentrification in certain neighborhoods of London. For sure, other factors have to be considered to explain this transformation and why it took place in these neighborhoods and not other. However, the normative dimension was essential in defining this urban transformation. Laws and regulations that manage urban space are the responsibility of public authorities, and already many researchers in the field of gentrification had pointed out to the role of authorities in fostering gentrification, and including the normative dimension. But I claim that until now, the role of this normative dimension was, let's say, underrepresented, especially that I would argue that this dimension is a determinant factor when it comes to the form, shape, and nature of gentrification. Moreover, I consider that any comparative approach not taking in consideration this dimension risks to fall in the realm of inaccuracy and ambiguity. Well, gentrification, as I understand it, and I'm pretty much in line with Eric Clark here, it is a process, a socio-spatial transformation consisting of 2 complementary components. From one hand, we have a production of an upgraded space through capital investment, and from the other, we have a change in population of land users with new users of a higher socioeconomic status than the previous one. And if you want to put it in a broader context, we already now talked about the various translation of the word gentrification or other. I'll refer to some French researchers such as Anne Clerval, where they argued that gentrification is a special case of embourgeoisement. Well, embourgeoisement is basically a social ascension, which does not require nor a space production or upgrading, neither a change in the population. Well, let's go to Beirut. There are several forms of gentrification taking part in Beirut. I'll address the most dominant one. It's a resident gentrification, basically consists on evicting old tenants, demolition of old buildings, and the construction of upscale high-rises for a much wealthier and different population. I'll take the example of the area of and around Fern El Hayek. It's less than 1 square kilometer, and for the period between 2000 and 2010, nearly 350 families were evicted, more than 50 old buildings were demolished, and nearly an equivalent number of upscale high-rises was constructed. This transformation was accompanied by mounting speculation that reached a 5-fold increase in land prices. Well, this map is basically combines the previous two slides. In the first half of the decade, it seems that most evicted tenants, well, they are mainly middle to low income population. Most of them found a new accommodation inside Beirut, but in more affordable areas such as Jaitawi. Later on, as housing and rental prices soared, evicted residents moved to the suburbs or even to localities such as Amshit, 40 kilometers to the north of Beirut. As for new residents or gentrifiers, they can mainly be grouped in three categories: Lebanese expats, Lebanese higher classes, and Gulf nationals. This is a very brief overview of the situation. What I will focus on is the normative dimension in this process, precisely the combined effect of a couple of laws and regulation. I'll start with the master plan of Beirut. It has remained the same since 1954. It is very basic, like many restrictions. It mainly sets the exploitation ratio. In other terms, the maximum amount of square meters that can be constructed on a certain plot. For the area shown earlier, there are no defined uses for each zone, no height limit for construction, no setbacks from neighborhood parcels. It even allows an increase in the exploitation in certain cases. And in the past 60 years, most effort to amend or introduce a new master plan were constantly hindered by political pressure. On the opposite, if we take the law of construction, it is periodically amended, mainly to increase height of the buildings and the exploitation ratios through adding more exceptions. The latest promulgated law was in 2004. With the result, we have an increase of around 30% in exploitation in comparison to the previous one. And this means also it doubles the original exploitation ratio. And it also increases the height of buildings by 25%. This will lead to an increased profit for developers, especially when it comes to the height of buildings. Since in Beirut, the price of apartments increased by at least $100 per square meter per floor. If we take the example of Trabot 1804, this is the list of apartments and their prices. Well, I did some calculation, and this increase of 30% in the exploitation represents around 45% of the building's price. So basically, due to the adoption of the latest law of construction, in one day, a rent gap was created or increased. Usually, the explanation of rent gap follows the line of devaluation, revaluation. But in this case, the cycle is not a necessity. A rent gap can be created without a devaluation, and that by just keep on increasing the value. Here I was examining several rent gap in Beirut. The one I was talking about is in the middle row to the left. But still, this is still work in progress. Let's go back to my favorite building. Well, if you notice in the dark gray in the table, these are the sold apartments. The date is January 3rd, 2011. The excavation work for this building didn't start until a couple of months later, in June or April 2011. And this is a common practice that developers try to sell the building before constructing it, and that to finance its construction, well, rather it's to secure the financial profit. Moreover, and as I was told by several prominent architects, there are a tight web of relation that connects the real estate developer, investor, and significant number of real estate clientele, mainly the higher Lebanese classes. And on many occasions, they keep on buying from each other to circulate money or to have profit from speculation. Also, it's worth noting that the first phase in the design of a building is called the exploitation study. Basically, it is the maximum amount of square meters that can be filled in a parcel, as well as the projected price and profit. And some of the well-known architects are not only known for their design, but also for their mathematical ingenuity to reach this maximum square meters. Additionally, and based on this study, many developers withdrew from projects in case they could not achieve 400% profit on their initial investment. So the mounting land speculation, the incentives offered by this regulation, the prospect of enormous profit, all led to a frenzy of new construction in Beirut, and the latest real estate boom or bubble started in 2005 after the adoption of the law of construction. It lasted till around 2010, 2011. It's another story. Well, but since Beirut is densely built, the majority of new constructions has to take place at the expense of existing ones. And in this context, the laws on built heritage or the lack of them facilitates this task. Until now, all the effort to introduce a new law on built heritage were hampered. The latest draft of law is still stalling in the parliament for years. The only regulation is the law on antiquities dated to 1933 that only protects pre-18th century construction. And 2 decades ago, there was a list drawn to protect a number of traditional houses in Beirut. However, the list is temporary, and there are many ways to circumvent this protection and delist buildings. And nowadays, nearly half of these listed buildings are totally or partially destroyed. Well, I reached the topic of this presentation, the law on rent. Prior to 1992, Lebanon's rent law was a strict rent control, as in fixing or putting a cap on rent prices, extending rent period indefinitely. Rent control is inherited by the spouse or children of the deceased renter, very strict condition to terminate a contract, and so on. A situation similar to nearly all rent control around the world. The peculiarity of the Lebanese case was a product of the 1980s, the war years, where, well, this is demolished building, and this graph shows the sharp devaluation of the Lebanese currency. So from one hand, we have a sharp devaluation of the currency. On the other, we have a lack of any action by the state to correct the prices accordingly. For example, at the end of the war, in many cases, the monthly rent was equivalent to the price of a loaf of bread. In 1992, a new law on rent was promulgated, totally liberalizing new contracts. However, a temporary freeze was put on pre-1992 contracts, coupled with a correction of rent price, but they still far below market prices. They're nearly 10% in comparison with a new one. Well, the reason for this temporary measure, because, well, you have housing crisis, there is economic hardship, and because the Lebanese state is a typical economic liberalism state who nearly does not invest in social housing. In all its history, there's only one project constructed for social housing after 50 years of... anyway, so the state, instead of providing social assistance, it chose to put the burden on the shoulders of some of the property owners. Old rent contracts have to be viewed as an exception to the law that was renewed on a yearly basis. As for post-1992 contracts, they are signed for a period of 3 years maximum, after which another new contract is negotiated. A situation clearly in favor of property owners, allowing them to keep on extracting and increasing financial profit from their properties. The situation is far less favorable for property owners according to the old rent. Well, they are deprived of any prospect of profit making via rent increase. The only solution is to abrogate these contracts, and the most practical way to do so is an Article 8C, which says that the upcoming demolition of the building and the reconstruction of a new one. Well, these conditions created by old rent, the constraints facing property owners, and especially the weakness of their bargaining position vis-a-vis developers, resulted in these property owners to be more willing to pay, to sell their properties or go into partnership with real estate investors. The ensuing result is that most of the real estate bubble took place in lieu of old rented building. And this was confirmed by two field research, one that I coordinated in 2011, and another by the master students at the Lebanese University Department of Urban Planning a couple of months ago, where it was revealed that in both surveys, 5 minutes. that in both surveys, the overwhelming majority of evicted tenants had old law contracts. Okay, we need to add a, what do you call it, clarification or a disclaimer. In the case of Beirut, well, there is nearly no statistics, no data at all. But so we can't know the number of new contracts, all old contracts. But for sure, there's plenty of tenants according to the new contracts. And even I claim that it's there, the majority, but still we can't know because we are in an environment of total lack of data. We can just only base our research on qualitative rather than quantitative research. Beirut situation offers a certain paradox. Usually rent control is considered as some sort of a barrier against gentrification. However, in a setting where the two types of law exist, rent control and liberalization, gentrification develops through the regulations that can offer the highest amount of profit. To sum it up, the law of construction and master plan keep on maximizing profit from land. The lack of or the obsolete laws on urban heritage remove an obstacle from an urban renewal based on demolition, reconstruction. And this urban transformation was mostly channeled through the law on rent that offers the real estate industry better opportunities, which is the rent control. For sure, well, I would say that gentrification is mainly the result of capital dynamics and investments, but the form that it will take, its nature, and are mainly conditioned by the existing laws, and more precisely how much profit can be extracted from these laws. If you want to put it a bit in a comparative perspective, let's take Beirut, Paris, Berlin. For example, in Paris, it's forbidden to construct towers after they build the Tour de Montparnasse, and you have a strict law on built heritage. So the form in gentrification there cannot be compared to Beirut if you don't take these regulation, because then it will be obsolete. If you take the case of Berlin, you don't have a strict law on heritage, but there you have other factors, mainly the law on rent, which is still rent control, but in the clauses of the law, the landlord can increase nearly 11% per year the rent in case they modernize the apartment. So what property owners do, and they are mainly real estate companies, they keep on modernizing apartments to keep on increasing the rent or to push the tenants out. Okay, there are other factors. For example, the state stopped paying subsidies. You have also other laws. Mainly, I was talking about laws that regulate the relation with the space. Well, what I wanted to say is, for example, in Berlin, nearly 10 years ago, there was a law that, the people can have a say in the build of their environment. 10 years ago, there was a law in order for you to participate in these talks, you have to be registered. Thus, you need to have an address. Thus, all the homeless were evicted from the discussion. Also, well, let's go back to Beirut, and let's try to approach this topic from the gentrifier side or consumption side. In my research, I've been talking with some gentrifiers, mainly Lebanese expats, and for nearly most of them, to live in these high-rises was not what they aimed to or dreamt of, but rather that was the best option they can get in Beirut. And here it is revealing to examine how these high-rises are marketed. An example is, let's take a page from the brochure of Le Patio. As you can see, you will live surrounded by nature, traditional individual housing, etc. But this is the building you're gonna live in, and this its location. And soon you'll be surrounded by other high-rises. The first slide is what gentrifiers want to. The second one is what they can get. And mainly because it's the most profitable way for developers, and that's because what the laws allow them to do. And I claim that this logic, as well as the prominent role of laws, exists and shape most, thank you, most gentrification around the world, but it's more or less subtle. The beauty, well, not the beauty, the significance of the case of such as Beirut, that it is more radical, more obvious. Okay, I still have a couple of points. Maybe I can talk of them in the discussion. So I'll stop now and thank you.
I would like to start my presentation with a story of an ordinary low-rise building in the Hamra district of Ras Beirut. One of this sort. The story behind it can be quite predictable. Many heirs, old tenants, low income or absentee landlord or something of this sort. And the future of buildings like this is also quite predictable. Demolition and reconstruction. As it turned out, the building is owned by one of Ras Beirut's old Muslim Sunni families who call Ras Beirut its own and whose holding to its indigenous claim to urban land. The person who constructed it died a long time ago, and ownership filtered down to his 6 children, then his grandchildren. Ownership today is divided into 6 shares belonging to more than 20 heirs. Iyad, my informant, is one of the grandchildren. With his siblings, he inherited his father's share, including a family-operated traditional bakery, Furun Manaish, at street level. Iyad doesn't have, Iyad doesn't have high-level education. He labors at the bakery to earn a living. It doesn't take long to realize his anger and frustration. He's property rich and cash poor. The upper floor of their property was leased out under Lebanon's old rent law and hardly provides them with any income. Business has been seriously affected by competition from Syrian bakeries that, to use his words, invaded Hamra after the eruption of the Syrian crisis. The different shareholders are in disagreement and they strongly wish to split. Noting the property's strategic location and construction potential, it wasn't surprising to learn that more than 14 different land developers approached the family, who finally struck a deal with the ones who made the best offer. These, to use Iyad's words again, are 2 partners, a Muslim and a Christian, an architect and a businessman. After buying the existing tenants out, and after demolishing the existing structure, the developer will finance the construction of a 14-story residential tower. According to Iyad, one of the apartments in the new building will be his. He plans to divide it into 2, live in one, and furnish the other, then lease it out at $3,000 per month. Although he's hardly in his mid-30s, Iyad says that after the construction of the new building, he wants to retire and enjoy being a landlord. He concludes that his story is a success story, since he will continue to reside in Ras Beirut, and unlike many other native Ras Beirutis who had to sell and leave their area to the strangers that are taking it from them. Despite its utmost relevance, the political economy factors driving Beirut's thriving upscale real estate market and instigating the new build gentrification of many of its central areas is not the main reason why I recounted Iyad's story. Iyad captured my attention in the first place by his overwhelming sense of social injustice and revanchist desire to reclaim his family's property, to use it as means for moving up in social status from a working class baker to a new landlord. Second, I was caught by his indigenous claim to Ras Beirut and his estrangement of others who had invaded it and sidelined its rightful owners. Third, I was alerted by his highly sectarian and prejudiced tone, which points to the fact that the property politics in the context of a city like Beirut cannot be dissociated from Lebanon's political and social divisions, which are largely manifested along religious sectarian lines. I would like to expand on these issues with reference to the accounts of other native Ras Beirutis. I'm particularly interested in understanding the area's changing land ownership patterns and social milieu from their perspective. I'll end up by some reflections on gentrification and the politics of mobility in Ras Beirut. So let me start by the revanchist sentiments of old landlords. It's well known that Lebanon old rent law has been unfair to them. Feeling cheated out of the real value of their property, some have tried to take it by force and some by legal and legally dubious means. Not all landlords have been nasty and not all tenants have been victims. Lebanon's old owner-tenant battle is first and foremost a result of the failure of the Lebanese state to assume its social responsibility in the affordable housing sector and other social sectors for this matter. And with this in mind, I want to move away from arguments that focus on the revanchist desires of old landlords to arguments that draw attention to the overall social insecurities of Lebanon's low and middle income groups. Indeed, many middle and low income earners, regardless if property owners or tenants, share the unsettling feeling of social insecurity that stems from the country's realities of unemployment, economic hardships, inadequate public health and education systems, lack of affordable housing strategies, and absence of unemployment and retirement guarantees. If a foreign passport has become a safety net for some, for others, personal savings and assets remain their only security against need, illness, and old age. A young, unprivileged person like Iyad certainly has ambitions. The construction boom around him and the promised affluence of partnering with a land developer who proposes to bring the family's property to its highest and best use ignites his dreams. If he's able to stay in Ras Beirut, the same is not true for many of those in a situation like his. Although not a disadvantaged group per se, Ras Beirut small property owners are in fact highly vulnerable to displacement pressures. I would like to illustrate this point with reference to the area of Jal al-Bahr, where vacant and underdeveloped properties are abundant. Like the rest of Ras Beirut's waterfront, Jal al-Bahr is experiencing a proliferation of super luxurious residential buildings targeting Lebanon's powerful elite, members of the Lebanese diaspora, and rich Arab nationals, as evident from their amenities and the huge floor plates. The lower part of the area, distinguished by its small land subdivisions, low-rise buildings, and the traditional home gardens, is still partially owned and inhabited by some native Druze families, which is a religious group in Lebanon. These families were historically major landowners. Traditional practices of property grants and divisions have, however, led to the fragmentation of their lands. Despite continuous processes of urban change, the area is believed to have maintained for decades its a social and culturally mixed character. Demographic and the property owner transformations became visible during Lebanon's civil war period, whereby many residents, mainly Christians, fled away after selling their properties. Those who bought from them are mostly investors who got the land and often big parcels of land or small adjacent parcels like the ones shown here, at cheap prices and waited in anticipation of a future surplus value. Today, the remaining indigenous landowners of Jal al-Bahr seem compelled to subdue to the power of big land developers who have surrounded their area. Some have actually sold or entered into partnership agreements with them, like the example of this family, what their house before and what they have now. The reasons are manifold. I have identified 6. Ownership fragmentation as a result of inheritance laws, which today, as in the past, is leading to many family conflicts and a desire to sell. The desire of a better future for their family, for their children, is another reason, but their drive to sell cannot yet be seen only in sacrificial terms, since the cash they are getting from their property is clearly beyond their subsistence needs. Indeed, the need for cash is a major reason affecting people's relocational choices. Even some of those who struck deals with land developers seem to have reconsidered their position in favor of cash. This is because the majority of the native residents of the area are, they do not have steady jobs and secure incomes. And some actually have sold or leased their apartments at outrageous prices and willingly relocated to other areas. Status incongruity is another reason to why some of them find themselves compelled to leave. As one area resident explains, the new buildings are super luxurious and not fit to their lifestyles. In living in these apartments, they are burdened with all sorts of unforeseen payments like municipal taxes and maintenance costs, which they cannot afford. Zoning regulation is another key concern among owners of small properties, given that the application of required setbacks will render their parcels undevelopable in the future. All the yellow ones are substandard if we want to apply the zoning regulation. Neighborhood livability also emerges as a key factor leading to further out-migration. Paradoxically, while some see new construction to have positively contributed to the image of their area, they tend to talk about the transformation of their area in negative terms. In most accounts, the figure of the stranger emerges as a source of social ills and a reason justifying their desire to leave. I would like to further elaborate on the figure of the stranger, whose identity is remarkably politicized and polarized against the identity of native Ras Beirutis. In fact, it can be inferred from people's account that they are talking about two types of strangers. The ones taking over Ras Beirut's street life, the visible group, and the ones buying a property and displacing them, the invisible group. So who is the stranger? Like elsewhere in Lebanon, the Syrians have become a scapegoat for all sorts of urban problems: crime, illness, pollution, besides being accused of taking over Lebanon from the Lebanese. The Muslim Shia, considered outsiders to Ras Beirut and Beirut in general, are not less accused by some of taking Ras Beirut from its rightful owners, not only by their sheer numbers, but also by their money and political power. Biased statements such as they are rich but not classy and they have more money but not better culture are not uncommon. The they here is not limited to affluent Shia, but includes, depending on the speaker, rich Syrians and Arab nationals from Gulf countries. Discontent about the recent strict security measures around the Saudi embassy, some have specifically referred to a Saudi taking over of Beirut. There are also accounts that allude to an American project that continues to destroy Ras Beirut, particularly the area of Ain al-Mraisi. Especially explicit about it are the residents of the Rub al-Muhabb al-Tanir, a predominantly Muslim Sunni neighborhood just outside AUB walls. A couple of decades ago, the residents of this area openly condemned AUB's expansionist policies and accused the university of having purposefully installed a deadly chimney in reference to the university's power plant to help it taking their property bit by bit. Unlike those who blame it on the stranger and the outsider, there are those who blame native people for failing to cherish their inherited property, and the Lebanese politician and powerful elite for buying and selling Lebanon. I don't have time to expand on this issue, but the question that I would like to stop at is, who did native Ras Beirutis sell to or partner with? Among my informants, even some of those who seemed most attached to their old house and those who clearly judged urban problem along ethnic and religious sectarian lines admitted that in the end, they would do what is good for them. Explicitly, they said, sorry, they said that they will sell if this is in their interest. The nationality and the religion of the buyer did not emerge as a key issue. Even the strictest native Sunnis of Ras Beirut, according to one real estate broker, would have a twofold judgment when it comes to selling a vacant plot of land or an entire old building to someone from the Shia community. On the one hand, they would resent selling a stranger Shia in fear that this person is connected to Hezbollah party and is after building a Shia mosque or Husseiniye inside their area. On the other hand, they wouldn't mind selling to a well-reputed land developer from the Shia community if the deal is financially good for them. The need for cash is therefore the most salient reason that leads native low and middle income families to sell. Their actions cannot yet be seen in isolation from Lebanon's political and religious sectarian fragmentation. Indeed, the question of a property is highly politicized in the context of Lebanon and needs to be understood in relation to broader national and regional processes of urban restructuring as perceived by different political groups. For example, there are those who argue that it's easier for the Druze to sell their land in Ras Beirut since Ras Beirut is the turf of the Sunnis, while Mount Lebanon is the turf of the Druze. Here, like the Shia-Sunni divide, the growing fundamentalism in the region, and parallel political projects to redraw the map of the Middle East emerge as part of a broader discussion on the politics of a property in Lebanon, something which falls beyond the scope of my presentation and research. I would like to wrap up by expanding a bit on the theme of gentrification and the politics of mobility. As I see it, much of Ras Beirut's current processes of urban change can certainly be associated with the gentrification and rent gap theories. The mobility of capital has tremendously inflated the property sale and rental prices, which has led to direct, indirect, and exclusionary acts of displacement. However, a gentrification lens also obscures the complexity and the plurality of area transformations and the existence of other unjust acts of property dispossession and population movements. The stories that I collected from Ras Beirut illustrate the presence of intricate social and spatial mobilities that cannot be captured by the gentrification paradigm. These mobilities, I contend, and their ensuing socio-spatial divisions and inequalities largely stem from a country context suffering from social insecurities and highly susceptible to political manipulations and rivalries. I would like to explain a bit further. Okay, first. Okay. No one is forcing small native landowners to sell their land or to relocate from Ras Beirut. They are doing it deliberately, even if reluctantly, and they are getting good money out of it. They cannot be victimized, and it is naive to assume that they don't bear the stamps of a growing materialistic society. Still, their decision to sell and leave cannot be dismissed as voluntary displacement. Like the property sales practices of less affluent native Ras Beirutis reflect their inner divisions and self-contradictions. Their sense of attachment is being negotiated, sold, and sacrificed when put face-to-face with their desire for economic security and prosperity. And therefore, physical mobility, to use Tim Cresswell's word, is socially produced and given meaning within relations of power. Second, Ras Beirut's emerging new social order cannot be read in terms of a neat division between two groups of land users, an existing group displaced by an incoming group of much higher socioeconomic status and power. Nor can Beirut's urban restructuring order be reduced to a neat division between a gentrifying center and underprivileged periphery. The unaffordability of central areas of Beirut's central areas is certainly leading to the emergence of new centralities around Beirut. But these centralities are characterized by their apparent fragmentation. Beirut continues to be an employment center to the great majority of the working age population. Home to AUB, Beirut's biggest private employer, and other institutions, Ras Beirut itself remains a vibrant commercial and leisure hub that caters for the needs of a wide range of social and income groups. Its emerging new spatial order is yet characterized by its fragmentation. Here, different socioeconomic groups occupy proximate but alienated spaces. It is this surge of inequality that is leading many low and middle income Lebanese to believe that there is a conspiracy plan to mass evict them. Dramatically increasing living expenses, uneven geographic development, inadequate public transportation systems, and the general sense that national assets are dominated by the country's powerful elite explains public discontent. On a final reflective note, I would like to say that Lebanon's current situation of crisis requires more than rethinking the distribution of public services and goods. Unless serious institutional and legal reforms are implemented, and unless socially motivated urban development policies are articulated and enforced, Beirut's socio-spatial divisions and inequalities are likely to grow and intensify. The human, social, and political repercussions will certainly be grave, and more than anything, the notions of state and citizenship are here at stake. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to the previous speakers for already explaining so much so that I can skip some things because we don't have much time. I'm going to present a book chapter that I co-authored with Christian de Beukelaar, who is currently employed as a lecturer in cultural management at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. And he worked on the creative economy, so his contribution to my chapter was about that, basically. This book chapter has been published in a book that has been promoted a lot at this conference already, so thank you for that. And it responds to several calls to extend the geographical scope of gentrification studies and to consider the potential contribution of theory making from the global south. So it's something that we have spoken about already at this conference. I will present this chapter. I will skip some things because it has already been explained by Hisham and Mona. And then I will discuss a little bit what I've been working on since and respond a little bit to some of the things that have been said at this conference already. So I will present two case studies of gentrification in Beirut, one in the neighborhood of Zola Blad and one in the neighborhood of Marieke Krijnen. They will show a bit how gentrification differs from the literature, from the mainstream literature, but also especially how within one city there can be such different gentrification processes. So I guess you all know a little bit what is going on at this point. I would say that gentrification in Beirut is at the end, even though it has some local specificities, some political specificities, in the case of Beirut, I think at the end it is still driven by the same forces as elsewhere, you know. So it's driven by a privileging of the logic of the market in housing provision. It has resulted in displacement and exclusion of lower and middle income groups. Transnational capital, it has been facilitated by state intervention, as Hisham explained. So at the end, you know, I think it is not that different. So you see here some examples of some of the large-scale projects that are happening. Real estate is currently, the market is in a slowdown because, well, it has stagnated. It hasn't gone down, but it's currently stagnated because of the political crisis and all these things. Still, apartments in Beirut sell for around $1 million on average. So that just gives you an idea of the market and the kind of buildings that are being constructed, like this one, which basically for me represents like a giant, you know, middle finger towards the city. So it's mostly new build, as you already know. My two case studies are these two neighborhoods. So I will speak a little bit first about, well, I don't really have to speak about the background of gentrification in Beirut that much because I think it has already been explained sufficiently. So I just wanted to move on to the case study of Zoelenblad, so just to have some illustrations actually to what already has been said. So what I want to focus on, despite the role of, on top of the role of rent controls, as has been explained already, and the role of the new building law, and the role of the zoning system with high exploitation ratios, actually no maximum building height if you apply for a special permit, which most developers actually get, so they can, you know, they can construct up to 44 stories high. This is all providing an incentive for landlords to sell, you know, so this is what has been explained so far. What is also important to remember is that developers have been speculating by buying in times of stagnation and then selling as soon as the political crisis or the conflict or whatever it is over. So in Zoelenblad, so my case study, you can see that there's a lot of new build gentrification going on. It's a special case because there are still a lot of squatters, so refugees that fled during the civil war to Zoelenblad and actually also moved into residences that were evicted by other people who fled that neighborhood. And they brought some militias with them that ensured their protection and provided social services for them. Today it's located very close to downtown Beirut, so you see the green line is actually the boundary of Solidaire, which is the private company that basically, you know, kind of owns downtown Beirut. So that doesn't fall within the scope of my case study, but the cadastral area of Zoelenblad is this officially, but it actually is only under the green line. So it's very close to downtown. And actually what happened is that because Solidaire has some kind of a master plan with a protected view corridor towards the sea, a lot of developers are cashing in by building outside the Solidaire boundaries and going very high so they can sell that sea view and they know that nobody will, you know, build in front of them. We'll see how long that lasts because Solidaire is full of exceptions and so anyway. It's an area with a lot of old buildings still existing. Some squatters are protected by political parties such as Hezbollah or Amal, but also some people are getting evicted. So yeah, there is a lot of old buildings where people are living on old rent control or as squatters. When you talk a little bit to people, they are complaining that these new buildings that are getting built are meant for people outside, so they are talking about the Lebanese diaspora, and that a lot of residents have been moved out and they moved actually to the southern suburbs of Beirut. Some people were paid only $5,000 as compensation. So these are numbers that are actually quite low, but you know, this was told to me by an Egyptian worker, so there's a lot of precarious workers residing in this area that are affected by this kind of displacement politics. Rents have been raised a lot. Some people took 2 to 3 jobs in order to be able to pay the rent. You know, these are the new buildings under construction. One woman told me, like, you know, she owns a small hairdressing salon. You know, if you want to meet people, you should go and get a haircut and, you know, talk to them and stuff. And she told me that her rent up in the building was $1,300 a month, you know, which is completely insane. Because the minimum wage in Lebanon is, what is it now, $450? Yeah, so just think about that, you know? And she told me, I am slowly dying trying to pay the rent and trying to stay. So even though maybe some people are staying, they have to take 2 or 3 jobs in order to stay. So think about that, you know? Here, yeah, that's a map of some new developments, some finished developments, and you see in red the buildings that were demolished, and this map was made in 2010, so think that, you know, it has already changed. Then I am moving on to the next case study where there's a different type of gentrification going on. So it's not only new build, but also kind of creative and commercial gentrification, where this kind of this idea of, the creative economy is taking shape. So in Beirut, you have some state actors, some non-state actors that are supporting this idea of the emerging creative industries in Beirut as kind of a fix for the brain drain of Lebanon, that it would facilitate the knowledge economy. And there is actually a big area under construction just under downtown next to Zoeleblad, actually, which is called Beirut Digital District. And it has been, well, it's a long story, it's another case study, but this is kind of facilitated by the state. In the Marieke area, where you see a lot more of creative entrepreneurs who have moved in, it hasn't been supported by the state at all, but some NGOs have jumped on this, such as Gaia Heritage and the British Council. So just to say, who's also behind this idea. It was mostly spontaneously, though. There were well-connected Lebanese entrepreneurs who started to move in there. So I will just show you a bit the quarter. It's mixed residential commercial. A lot of villas, residences from the 1930s are surviving. Again, I was actually thinking about this, that a lot of these areas used to be where the aristocracy moved out of the city in the 19th century. So, and later the houses became subdivided, or like lower income families moved in. So it's actually interesting to see how it's also, changing in terms of social class, this, but that on the side. So until 2008, it was like a very, called like a sleepy quarter, very, residential, also industrial. There were a lot of car mechanic shops, a lot of, large, tool shops and stuff like that. After the Armenian genocide in 1915, a lot of refugees settled in the district, so it still has a distinctly Armenian character. But it started transforming in 2008 because there was a lot of nightlife in the neighboring district, and it started to spill over into Marieke. Also, a lot of art galleries opened, a lot of pubs, a lot of boutiques, a lot of designer shops, and things like this. They all opened one after another. It has been a gigantic boom. The prices of land were lower, so it attracted also a lot of property investors and developers. And they also viewed the area as the next place to be. They sold it as such on their websites, the next hip area, blah, blah, after a few, pioneers bought some empty lots and old houses, some bigger guys moved in. They merged the plots, they demolished the existing buildings, and then they constructed towers. So this is generally how it goes. Many tenants are actually, most tenants in Marieke are living on the old rent contracts that Hisham has explained so well. Owners are then selling out to developers because they get a good price for their land, and the developers pay the tenants a sum to leave. So when you ask people about this, who are still living on the old rent, they complain, about the state their house is in. I've been speaking to an old lady whose ceiling was falling down on her at night and stuff like that. Like you really see like all the plaster falling off the walls. So she was like, I'm happy to go. I don't want to live in such conditions, So it's, on top of that, there's a lot of noise from the bars. So residents are also suffering from displacement pressure in that sense. Like they don't feel at home, as Professor Peter Marcus has theorized, displacement pressure. They don't feel at home anymore there. It's not comfortable. There have been two waves of young creative entrepreneurs that have settled in the area. At first, they were attracted by the low prices of land, and then by the developing cultural and creative industries in the area. It's mostly designers, architects, and art and IT professionals. A lot of their clients are coming from outside of the area, and actually a lot of them rely on selling their stuff in Europe and other places. So it's not really like a, local market in that sense. And very often they set up shop in historic buildings. So here you see kind of a different dynamic than you see in Zoeleblad or in Ashrafiyeh, because the buildings are actually preserved in that way. So because they move into these old buildings, the landlords can charge a very high rent, and then actually the building is, probably temporarily preserved. With the bars, it's even worse. I spoke to one guy who owns the shop. He pays $4,000 a year. The gallery on the other side of the street pays $22,000 a year. And some bars pay $6,000 a month. Think about that, right? So actually, when the ground floor is rented out to a bar, then sometimes the tenants upstairs are kind of, temporarily protected from eviction because the landlord makes enough money. And you see also the difference within one building that, one person paid $1,300 for an apartment in that building, and another one on the old rent paid $100 a month for that same building. So this is just a map illustrating the spillover. This is, I'll skip through this a bit. It's one of the real estate projects that has actually been developed by the son of former late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, which is, you see how it's completely out of context in the neighborhood, basically. The tenants of the buildings that were here before were paid in total $1 million to leave. There were 8 tenants there, and prices of these apartments range from $500,000 to $1 million. There is currently around 12 real estate projects in the area, so that it's kind of, the skyline is starting to transform. Another case, a developer paid $12 million to the owner of a building and paid the tenants to leave. So the neighbor said, yeah, these people, they almost died having to leave the house where they lived in for generations. So on the one hand, people are saying, like, I don't want to live in these conditions, but on the other hand, it's very painful for people to go. Think about, the developer will sell for $3,000 the square meter. So if he builds 20 floors and you have 200 square meter apartments per floor, you can just think about how much money these people are making. And a lot of people are moving to the northern suburbs, or they are moving actually back to their village of origin, especially old people who don't have any other form of income. They sometimes just move back to where they came from, to their mountain house. Then this is just the developer demolishing stuff. Bobo, they are playing with this hip area. It's called Bobo, yeah. Live what you love. Anyway, so as has already been said, most buyers are from the Lebanese diaspora, because 50% of households in Lebanon live on less than $6,500 a year. So you can imagine that most people who live in Lebanon are not part of this housing market in any serious way. Also, of course, some people have kind of profited from this boom, because I spoke to one guy who rented out 2 of his mechanic shops to bars, and he's making a lot of profit. So, it's, of course, some people are also profiting from this, but that's only if you own the place. So for people on rental contracts, it's generally bad news. Most people also don't live in these buildings, so you don't see the kind of impact that you usually see on the commercial landscape of a neighborhood that is gentrifying. You don't see this everywhere. Of course, in McGill, you see a big commercial transformation, but in other neighborhoods, like in Zoleblad, when I worked for Majal, we surveyed 400 shops, and hasn't changed, You wouldn't think so, but really, didn't find anything. So it's not just about commercial changes when a new class of people moves in, because a lot of people are actually not living in these houses. You think it's my conclusion, but I have more slides, I'm sorry. Yeah, I added them after yesterday. So I just wanted to add something about the resistance to gentrification processes, which is usually negotiated through political parties that are closely linked to people's sectarian affiliations. And that only happens when it's a really large-scale project. Otherwise, there's not much resistance. I mean, the old tenants are resisting the new law on rents that is being planned currently. But in terms of any resistance to that, it's not really happening. Also, any affordable housing is usually built by religious organizations. Actually, the Maronite Church is the biggest landowner in Lebanon, so think about that. And heritage preservation organizations are resisting the demolition of buildings, but not necessarily the eviction of tenants. So, yes. And what I just wanted to, since yesterday, what I wanted to talk about a little bit is, okay, you know, we know now, I think also after the previous presentations, the dynamics of gentrification in Beirut and what is happening and, you know, how it's happening. What I started to do in my latest case study of the Corniche and Nahr area in the east of Beirut, one of the last kind of unbuilt areas within the cadastral limits of the city, I started to look at basically the interconnection of, okay, I'll skip all that other stuff. The interconnection of banks, property developers, politicians, and their service providers. Like, who are these service providers that kind of like facilitate the transactions that are going on here? Law firms, accounting firms, real estate agents, consultants. So, because, you know, it's really a web of this kind of interest, and I think that, you know, as Tom said yesterday, like looking at the agents of capital, in that sense, it's really important. So you have, you know, banking country Lebanon. The banks are very much involved. They have a large, enormous liquidity. This has to do with the Lebanese diaspora. They are transferring their money to the banks. They're putting their money in the banks. There's a banking secret here, so, you know, it's very attractive. The interest rate is very high because the banks are lending to the Lebanese state, so the Lebanese state is paying a high interest on these loans, and then the banks can, again, pay the depositors a very high interest. And then also the central bank has been facilitating and subsidizing mortgages. So you see like an increasing financialization and, you know, let's say making people into debt or, you know, of the housing market. And this kind of like is also to compensate for the increasing unaffordability of housing in the city, right? So just some numbers on the mortgages that I've been looking at. The central bank allowed the banks, the Lebanese domestic banks, to use up to 90% of their reserve requirements for loans. So they've really been trying to encourage credit. And here there is some developers. So yeah, usually developers, they sell in advance or they take down payments, but increasingly they're taking out loans from the banks. And then, you know, if you just look at what I did, I started to look at all the shareholders and shareholders in the companies, but also shareholders in the bank. So I have this massive table, and then I started to highlight like recurring names in the same thing. So you can end up with these kind of tables like, okay, this guy, he's a minister and he's president of a bank in so and so many shares, and then he also has this real estate company, and you start to see how it all hangs together. And you know, I want to move away a bit from all this Hariri focus and Hariri story that's usually happening, because I think it is a much more general thing that is going on here. And you know, like, of course, I mean, it's beautiful, the Hariri story. It's just completely, you know, but I think that's one of the ways to go. So you trace the power of finance capital over urbanization, which I think is really where I'm moving towards right now. Who is facilitating this? Who is preparing the city for these kind of investments? And definitely focusing on the role of the Lebanese diaspora, not so much in influencing state policy, but in you know, participating in the flows of capital that are transforming this city. And I'm writing a paper about this with 2 people from World City Studies, and it will be published hopefully in Environment and Planning A. So next week we're interviewing more people about this. So this is the kind of data collection that I think might be useful to you know, keep an eye on these agents of capital. And I will stop there.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to keep building on this idea of elite politics and to complete previous presentations looking at the mechanism of urban transformation in Beirut. My contribution today investigates the salient role of powerful elites in the current politics of production. And I will start with this original quote. Housing is a commodity just like lemonade. Why shouldn't we adopt the same market-driven rationale? And it's held actually by many city builders you can meet here in Beirut. And this view encapsulates the way the city and its segmented real estate market have been restructured over the past 25 years. Indeed, in parallel to the post-war downtown reconstruction, the Lebanese capital experienced an intensive property-led process of urban restructuring that prioritized, as we have seen, the provision of upmarket residential units and rent-to-own programs. And in conflict-affected contexts of the Global South, such as Lebanon, the urban development literature, as well as local stakeholders, often depicts the state as failed or as following a partisan strategy in terms of urban development and housing provision. Yet, based on the analysis of the politics of production at work in post-1990s Beirut, other processes appear at play. And drawing upon an analytical framework inspired by the North American movement of urban political economy addressing the social construction of growth politics, this research contributes to an emerging body of scholarship exploring how entrepreneurial elites, despite differences and divisions, actually govern property development through the state in such fragile urban settings. So in other words, considering that property development is not largely the result of the workings of pure market forces, the objective is to investigate how and through what mechanism elites manage to make the state, and especially the central state in the case of Lebanon, a key player in providing an indirect but active support to property markets. So in this regard, I will first address the two mechanisms through which the ruling class uses public authorities to intensify the profitability of their own interest. I will then look at how the making of the reform of rent control that we have seen before is revealing about how elites intervene in the social production of growth politics. And finally, I'll try to identify the various ways the study of elite politics in Beirut may contribute to new findings and discussions in urban theory. So for those of you who are not familiar with the concept from the urban political economy literature, the American sociologists John Logan and Harvey Moloch refer to growth machines as the way nested interest groups with common stakes in development use the institutional fabric to intensify land use and make money. And this approach actually engages with the way growth strategies are defined and implemented. And the study of Beirut's urban politics gives us the opportunity to revisit growth machine theory and to look at the alliance of business and political interest groups in light of urban transformations occurring in non-Western and conflict interest environments such as Lebanon. So in the case of Beirut, a trans-sectarian coalition of private and public rent-seeking agents uses the central state institution and prerogatives to boost the growth of banking and property products. And two complementary mechanisms are then at play. On the one hand, as Marieke started to introduce, elites use the central bank's policy mix of monetary policy to secure permanent inflows of capital into the country. In other words, the Banque du Liban has a key role in attracting, stabilizing, and injecting enough financial liquidity into the machine. And this BDL facilitated availability of capital, then very much supports the inflation and speculation on land and property prices, benefiting the whole supply chain from landowners, banks, and developers to also public authorities with the increase of tax revenues. So among the other tools controlled by the Banque du Liban are the 2009 and 2013 stimulus packages, as well as a new one coming in 2015, in which, as Marieke said, 50% of credit facilities distributed by the central bank to commercial banks were reserved for subsidized housing loans to boost domestic demand. And on the other hand, on the government and parliament side, elites managed to uphold a progress legislative and regulatory framework. And indeed, as highlighted by Marieke, Hisham, and others in previous works, elites managed to prepare, lobby for, and adopt progress arrangements. So, for instance, with laws on the purchase of property for foreigners, or the construction law, or the current bills on green buildings and property leasing. But they also preserve the status quo in terms of planning and zoning law, and also in terms of taxation, since there is no tax on vacant property and no tax on land and property capital gain for individuals. So with this into perspective, today's focus is on how growth builders and their coalition organize and facilitate urban transformation by taking over the making of property-related laws to pursue a progress agenda, one which relies on the intensification of land use and on the further commodification of housing provision. And one of the most recent examples of this elite involvement is indeed the Parliament decision to unleash the end of rent control by voting a reform on the 1st of April of last year. And even though I will focus on the extent to which the elaboration of this reform sheds light on the social production of gross politics, I just have to add a few words about its underlying objectives and its actual beneficiaries to better situate what are the actual elite interests at play. So, as we have seen in previous presentation, rent control in Lebanon dates back from the late 30s and was renewed after the civil war in 1992. And it's not the aim here to detail the pros and cons of the system or of the reform, but it's however important to mention that the new law seems to pursue two underlying but major objectives. The first objective will be to broaden the rent-to-own housing market with the thousands of displaced households that are expected to vacate their apartments and arrive on the free markets. And the reform is indeed a good opportunity to extend the scope of financial products that are housing loans for the banking sector, and then ensure local demand for property construction. And the second objective will be to give the real estate industry the opportunity to take over and build more easily and more rapidly than it is doing now, premium land that is today underexploited. So there is, again, indeed a significant rent gap between today's use of the land and the substantial development rights granted by the 54 zoning, enabling more intensive developments in central areas. Such progress business direction are entrenched in the famous rationale of value-free development, arguing that the growth of banking and real estate industries spill over into other sectors and stimulate economic development for the city at large. So as such, in the wake of the 90s reconstruction, the reform accentuated the primacy of the business component of urban policymaking that gives priority to the support of bank and property sectors at the cost of the social component of policymaking, including, for instance, the provision of various types of housing solutions. So how can one then account for the direction of this reform? And who are then the actors behind this law and how it was elaborated? So to make a very long story short about the recent phase of the reform, a first bill was transferred to Parliament in 2004, but got stuck for years, mainly in the Justice and Administration Commission, that finally came up with an updated and modified version that was transmitted to the plenary session and then voted in 2014. And preliminary findings then show that it's precisely between 2009 and 2013 that a gross coalition may have exerted its influence over the reform design during closed-door meetings within the Commission. Indeed, in line with Pierre Bourdieu's claims on how a discourse is largely produced by the social space within which it's actually conceived, the composition of the social space, or the composition of the Commission within which the discussion about the reform occurred, revealed the role played by specific private and public agents, and the cooperation-based rationale built on a shared vision and agenda. So different groups attended the Commission meetings. First, we have MPs from all political parties who built a powerful consensus to liberalize rents, with the exception of a few members. And we had also consultative members, including legal experts, who strongly contributed to turning the issue of all rents into a technical or contractual question, and not into an urban question with far-reaching socio-political implication. We also had bank representatives who, according to various testimonies, pushed for giving all tenants more opportunities for housing loans. We also had bureaucrats representing various ministries, but they were obviously quiet during discussions. And conversely, we had tenants and owners associations that stopped participating to the discussion in 2008, then vanishing, at least officially, from the social space of the Commission. And the milestone of this lawmaking process finally came, according to, again, various testimonies, from the new proposal brought by two main actors, who then revealed to be the actual leaders of the reform. we had one former Minister of Justice, who is an MP of the Future Movement, and a housing expert who works for the private sector, where he's having a senior executive position in a major bank in Beirut. So in addition to the preparation of the law, its adoption during the plenary session is also very explicit, since the heads of political parties obviously transmitted instruction to adopt the reform that was finally voted almost unanimously. And this scenario then raises a series of questions, since, for instance, most of the few MPs who voiced serious concerns in commission actually adopted the very text they were harshly criticizing, before finally signing, for some of them, the two appeals feel against the law to the Constitutional Council. So this puzzling scenario also goes along with the hypothesis of an opportunity vote, since the Syrian crisis may have a role in the timing chosen by the parliament to vote this socially exclusive reform. Indeed, the current political instability and the limited probability to have any general election organized anytime soon have opened what we could call or name a window of opportunity for MPs to get rid of a thorny question that, contrary to other laws benefiting to bank and property interests over the past few years, this question may reveal problematic for their re-election. And this assumption of an opportunity vote is moreover reinforced by another puzzling element. Indeed, some members of the Parliamentary Commission wish to integrate the reform of rent control within a law package legislating on larger issues of taxation, transportation, or housing to anticipate some of the criticism. However, only the reform of rent control was put on the agenda and was adopted in a single article and without any parliamentary debate. So, as such, through complex and subtle efforts, the way this reform was elaborated and voted showed the extent to which a trans-sectarian elite coalition made of public and private agents such as elected officials, bankers, developers, lawyers, landowners, housing experts, how this coalition sees in the transformation of the rule of the game a key resource for controlling the social construction of land and property market. So what are the lessons to draw from this episode to better capture how is gentrification governed in Beirut, and to better understand how property-led city making is governed in contested cities open to global competition? So I had identified 3 key contributions, but because of time limits, I will focus on 3, and the 3 are maybe the most meaningful for a discussion in terms of urban theory. So in Beirut, as in many other cities, the ideological framework of growth coalitions lies in the primacy of profit, in the growth of the bank and real estate industry, and in the ongoing search for new land rents. And this framework is then the condition for the cooperation-based relationship and the possibility of consensus among agents. And put another way, an horizontal rationale based on elite interest comes add on and fuel vertical divisions of political sectarian nature. As such, this approach agrees with the analytical framework of gross machine politics, arguing within the very different socio-political environment of the US that the growth of the property market is often the cement for large coalition of ruling local conflicts and political divisions. And the case of Beirut then shows us that the idea may be also valid in conflict environments, where divisions are of a different nature and in many ways more structuring. Another maybe contribution will be that this episode also shows us that elites hold power from the coercive territorial and social control they impose on community, over community, in reference to the notion of power over. But elites also hold power from their cooperation within the social space of city making, in reference to the notion of power too. So the importance of these twofold form of urban power, or the two faces of urban power, teaches us that in contested cities such as Beirut, the competition or the conflict over urban space is just as much of a socio-economic nature for the capture of the exchange value by transpartisan interests, as of a political sectarian nature in terms of territorial control, tied to national or regional power dynamics. And furthermore, this focus on the role of elites in city making stresses the biases of the literature that tackle cities in conflict, mostly from an ethnic and political religious perspective, by only exploring what Henri Lefebvre coins the perceived or the lived dimension of space. But it then goes without another perspective centered on the construction of the conceived dimension of space, referring, in other words, to the actual mechanism of urban production that offer a substantial explanatory power by unraveling the role of class interest. And maybe the last potential contribution is that this research finally underlines, and like it's following up on some questions we started to discuss yesterday, but despite their numerous contextual limitations, meso-concepts such as the gross machine theory can provide promising heuristic constructs to better understand the interaction between public and private stakeholders in non-Western institutionally fragmented environments such as Lebanon. Or put differently, I contend that far from applying any normative model, some analytical tools from urban political economy can help recontextualize gentrification-like processes and are complementary with the emerging of post-colonial scholarship to analyze the governance of gentrification in what we call cities beyond the West. So in conclusion, the study of gross machine-like politics shed light on the various ways powerful elites govern city making through the state in Beirut. And by unraveling how they contribute to the social construction of property markets, this research traces the fact that the capacity to govern urban production in Lebanon is highly contingent on the elite capacity to create coalition overstepping political sectarian cleavages. And alongside the monetary prerogatives of the central bank, such coalition use the organization and control of public regulation as one of the main immaterial resources to pursue a progress agenda. So while the way city making function is similar to the way it does in many other countries, the process and the stakeholders at play in this gross machine seem specific to the post-war context of Lebanon, thus confirming, beyond a supposed neoliberal hegemony, the key role of the policy environment in the constitution of governance models. So furthermore, this research aims at demonstrating that in what Giddens or Fawaz Trabulsi names a dependent capitalist country such as Lebanon, where the social structure is not the only organizing principle of the society, political, sectarian, and class explanation are not mutually exclusive in apprehending coalition building and the competition over space tied to urban change. In other words, while there is no determinism in the effects of the socio-economic structure on the making of the city, there is no determinism either in the prevalence of unsettled political sectarian alliances over the class-based rationale in Beirut's urban policy and politics. So in this regard, this form of urban redevelopment, highly dependent not on the back to the city movement of people, but on the back to the country inflows of diaspora capital, this form of urban development doesn't challenge the agency of local stakeholders, but reinforces and reduces their power depending on circumstances. So the specifics of urban production in post-war Beirut finally reminds us that even in conflict cities open to global competition, local politics remains the major mediating driver of external influences and the key regulator of conflicts and interests. Thank you.